In September 2024, archaeologists excavating a stone enclosure at Gobekli Tepe announced a significant discovery. Beneath a crude rubble wall, lying face down in the dirt, was a carved human-like statue. The official explanation arrived quickly: a votive offering, a ritual gift placed deliberately by Neolithic worshippers as an act of devotion to their gods. The interpretation was stated with institutional confidence and reported without serious challenge. It deserves serious challenge. Gobekli Tepe is the oldest complex stone construction site on Earth. Its T-shaped limestone pillars are precision-engineered, astronomically oriented, and covered in sophisticated three-dimensional carvings that took extraordinary skill to produce. The wall beneath which this statue was found is uncut rubble. The statue itself was carved with a peg base designed for upright display. It was found horizontal and face down. What the physical evidence actually shows, what it reveals about who built this site, who came after them, and why it was ultimately buried, demands a proper account. Before the statue can mean anything, Göbekli Tepe itself has to be understood for what it truly is. Not what the standard textbook account suggests, not the sanitized version that positions it as an impressive but ultimately primitive religious site built by hunter-gatherers between ritual meals. What the physical evidence at the site demonstrates, when you look at it directly and follow it without the interpretive scaffolding that mainstream archaeology has built around it, is something the conventional timeline of human civilization has no comfortable place for. Gobekli Tepe sits on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, in the region ancient sources called Upper Mesopotamia. It was first identified by Kurdish shepherds and subsequently investigated by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt beginning in 1994. What Schmidt found beneath the surface of that hill was not a collection of crude standing stones. It was a complex of circular enclosures containing T-shaped limestone pillars, many of them exceeding 5 meters in height and weighing up to 10 tons, quarried from bedrock, shaped with precision, transported to the site, and erected in organized geometric arrangements. Carved into their surfaces in 3 dimensions were foxes, vultures, scorpions, aurochs, cranes, headless human figures, and abstract symbols whose meaning remains contested. The carving is not decorative scratching. It is controlled, deliberate, technically sophisticated stonework. The site covers 22 acres. Approximately 200 pillars are known to exist. Excavations have been underway for 30 years. Less than half the site has been uncovered. Here is what makes the standard explanation structurally untenable. Gobekli Tepe has been dated to approximately 9,600 BCE, placing its construction more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge and more than 6,000 years before the invention of the wheel. The civilization that supposedly built it, according to the archaeological consensus, consisted of hunter-gatherers operating without agriculture, without writing, without metal tools, and without any of the organizational infrastructure that every other monument of comparable ambition required. The pillars were quarried, shaped, and raised by people who, in the same breath, archaeologists describe as living in temporary encampments and subsisting on wild game. That tension has never been resolved. It has simply been restated with increasing confidence each time a new study emerges. What has emerged from the most recent peer-reviewed research pushes the problem further. Studies published in the last decade have proposed that specific arrangements of carvings on the pillars constitute the world's oldest astronomical calendar, potentially recording a catastrophic cosmic event dated to approximately 10,950 BCE. A civilization capable of encoding stellar events in stone over multiple enclosures across a 22-acre site is not a civilization that is adequately described by the word primitive. That is the foundation. Everything the statue reveals about this site stands on top of it. In September 2024, excavations in one of Gobekli Tepe's enclosures uncovered a carved humanoid statue approximately 0.5 meter in height. It was found lying face down at the base of a stone wall. Archaeologists announced the discovery with considerable enthusiasm. The statue, they said, had been placed there deliberately as a votive offering. a sacred object deposited beneath the wall as an act of ritual devotion, consistent with Neolithic spiritual practices documented at other sites across the region. The interpretation was presented as the natural conclusion of the physical evidence. It is not. Start with the wall itself. The walls that thread through Göbekli Tepe's enclosures are constructed from uncut stone rubble, rough, irregular, unmortared, and architecturally crude in every respect. They share no constructional language whatsoever with the T-shaped pillars that define the site. The pillars are quarried from limestone bedrock with controlled precision, shaped to exact geometric profiles, transported across meaningful distances, and raised upright in organized circular arrangements. The walls are piles of rough stone. Placing these two elements inside the same constructional tradition requires ignoring everything the physical fabric of the site demonstrates about the difference between them. They do not belong to the same building program. They do not reflect the same level of knowledge, intention, or capability. That distinction matters enormously for what the statue's location is actually telling us. Now consider the statue itself. It is a carved human figure, and its base is shaped as a peg, not a flat base designed for horizontal placement. A pointed peg specifically formed to be driven into the ground and held upright, vertical, visible. This is not an ambiguous detail. The object was engineered for a particular orientation, and that orientation was standing. It was found in the opposite orientation, face down, beneath rough rubble, in a wall that does not belong to the same construction phase as the precision pillars surrounding it. The votive offering interpretation requires accepting that the original builders of one of the most sophisticated stone construction sites in human prehistory chose to honor their gods by placing a carefully carved statue face down in the dirt beneath a heap of uncut rubble. It requires accepting that a statue built with a peg base for upright display was intentionally laid horizontal as its final resting position. It requires treating the wall as a meaningful ritual context, when the wall itself has no meaningful architectural relationship to anything else at the site. The physical evidence does not support this conclusion. What it supports is a different account entirely, one that begins with the recognition that what archaeologists found beneath that wall was not a ritual deposit. It was a displaced object. And the question of who displaced it and when is where the real story starts. The most coherent explanation for what the statue's location reveals is not complicated, but it requires accepting something that mainstream archaeology has been reluctant to state directly. Gobekli Tepe, as it currently exists, is not the product of a single construction program. It is the product of two. And the people responsible for the second phase were not the people who built the first. The evidence for this is not hidden. It is written into the physical structure of the site in terms clear enough that any careful observer can read it without specialist training. The T-shaped pillars belong to one constructional tradition, precisely engineered, geometrically consistent, decorated with complex three-dimensional imagery, and arranged in circular enclosures with probable astronomical orientation. The rubble walls belong to an entirely different one. Rough, uncut, architecturally unsophisticated, and in several locations built directly against the faces of pillars in ways that obscure the carved imagery those pillars were clearly designed to display. If the walls and the pillars were built by the same people as part of the same design intention, obscuring the carvings would be a contradiction so fundamental it would require explanation. No explanation has been offered. The obscuring simply exists, and the field has absorbed it without apparent discomfort. What the evidence suggests is a sequence. The original builders designed and constructed the enclosures, raised the pillars, carved the imagery, and oriented the entire complex with a precision that implies sophisticated astronomical knowledge accumulated over generations. At some point, that original occupation ended. The site was not immediately buried. It continued to be used. But the people who used it subsequently were not the people who built it. They found an existing structure of extraordinary sophistication and occupied it with the means available to them, which did not include the knowledge or capability that produced the pillars. They built with what they could build with. Rough stone, uncut rubble. crude walls filling the spaces between structures they did not fully understand and could not replicate. The statue belongs to the first phase. It was carved with a peg base because it was designed to stand. It stood somewhere within the original complex, visible, upright, part of whatever function the enclosures originally served. When the second occupants arrived and began modifying the site, the statue was displaced, toppled, moved, and eventually buried beneath the rubble wall that the later occupation added. Not as a ritual act, as a consequence of a site changing hands between two groups separated by knowledge, time, and probably centuries. This is not a fringe interpretation constructed to provoke. It is the interpretation most consistent with what the physical evidence at Göbekli Tepe actually shows. The site has two voices. Archaeology has been listening to only one of them. If the argument about two distinct construction phases sounds speculative, consider what it would take to resolve it definitively. You would need access to the full site. You would need every pillar excavated, documented, and examined in its complete form, so that the relationship between the pillars and the walls could be established across the entire complex, rather than inferred from the fraction that has so far been uncovered. That access does not exist. And the reason it does not exist, after 30 years of excavation at arguably the most important archaeological site on Earth, is a problem that deserves to be stated plainly. Of the approximately 200 pillars known to exist at Göbekli Tepe, roughly 128 remain completely buried, not partially uncovered, not awaiting final documentation. Completely buried, unexcavated, unseen, and unread. The imagery carved into their surfaces, whatever information those carvings carry about the people who made them and the world, those people were recording, remains underground. This is the current state of the most studied pre-agricultural site in human history, 3 decades after systematic excavation began. The situation with partially excavated pillars compounds the problem. Pillar 43 is the most widely reproduced, most extensively analyzed, and most publicly debated carving at the entire site. It appears in documentaries, academic papers, and popular histories as the primary visual reference for what Göbekli Tepe is. Its left face and lower section have never been fully excavated. They remain buried. What is carved there, whether it extends the astronomical narrative that researchers have identified in the visible portions or introduces something else entirely, nobody knows. The field's most important single object has not been completely seen. This is not a resource problem in any meaningful sense. Göbekli Tepe is not an inaccessible site buried under a mountain range or submerged beneath water. It is a rubble removal project on a hilltop in southern Turkey with an established excavation infrastructure already in place. The tools required to accelerate the work without compromising archaeological integrity exist and are in routine use at sites around the world. LiDAR scanning, photogrammetric documentation, systematic layer recording, and 360-degree filming can capture every detail of the removal process in real time. The physical barrier between the current state of knowledge and a fully documented site is stone and dirt. It is not technology, funding, or expertise. What remains buried at Göbekli Tepe may be the most consequential unread text in human history. The visible pillars have already produced proposals that fundamentally challenge the accepted timeline of organized civilization. The question of what the remaining 128 have carved into their surfaces is not an academic footnote. It is the central, unresolved question of the entire site, and it remains unresolved by choice. Of all the interpretive disputes surrounding Göbekli Tepe, the question of how and why it was buried is the one with the most direct bearing on everything else. It determines how the site should be read, who the builders were in relation to the people who came after them, and what the act of burial was actually intended to accomplish. The field has not settled this question. It has retreated from its original answer without producing a better one. The original consensus held that Gobekli Tepe was deliberately buried by its builders around 10,000 BCE. The site was intentionally filled in, covered over, and sealed beneath the earth by the same civilization that constructed it. That explanation carried a certain internal logic. A deliberate burial implies a deliberate reason: preservation, concealment, ritual closure, or response to an external threat. It positioned the builders as agents making a considered decision about the fate of what they had created. In recent years, that consensus has quietly shifted. A number of archaeologists now argue that the burial was not intentional, but natural. Incremental hillslide erosion across centuries gradually accumulated over the site until it was completely covered. The evidence they cite is the layered incremental nature of the fill material, which they interpret as consistent with slow natural deposition rather than deliberate backfilling. The physical geography of the site does not support this conclusion. Göbekli Tepe sits near the summit of its hill. The volume of material required to cover 22 acres of monumental stone architecture to the depth at which it was found has no plausible natural source in the surrounding topography. A hillslide requires a hill above the point of deposition. The site is near the top. The grade and available earth mass on the slopes above the enclosures cannot account for the scale of coverage the burial represents. Standing at the site and observing the actual inclination of the terrain relative to the buried footprint makes the natural erosion hypothesis extremely difficult to sustain. There is a further problem the natural burial theory cannot address. If tens of thousands of tons of earth and stone cascaded down over this site through repeated landslide events across centuries, the rubble walls threading between the pillars would not have survived. The pillars themselves, some weighing 10 tons and standing over 5 meters, would have been displaced. The site would show the chaotic signature of repeated mass movement events. It does not. It shows stratified, organized fill material consistent with deliberate, incremental, controlled deposition. The rubble walls, if they belong to a later occupation rather than the original construction, may be the mechanism of the burial itself. Filling the enclosures systematically, layer by layer, stone by stone, in a process designed not to destroy the pillars, but to preserve them. That is not erosion. That is intention. The timing of Gobekli Tepe's burial is not an isolated data point. It sits inside a much larger sequence of events, and when you place it there and look at what surrounds it, the coincidences accumulate past the point where coincidence remains a satisfying explanation. The Younger Dryas was a period of rapid and severe climatic disruption that gripped the planet between approximately 12,900 and 11,600 years ago. Temperatures collapsed within decades. Ice sheets that had been retreating reversed their advance. Sea levels destabilized. Ecosystems that had supported human populations across the northern hemisphere were dismantled within timescales too short for gradual adaptation. The cause remains debated, but the leading hypothesis, supported by physical evidence found across multiple continents, involves a cosmic impact event. Fragments of a disintegrating comet striking the Earth and triggering a global environmental cascade. The Younger Dryas ended abruptly, approximately 11,600 years ago, with rapid warming that drove significant sea level rise across the planet. Gobekli Tepe was buried at approximately the same moment. That correlation alone would be noteworthy. What makes it something more than noteworthy is the content of the pillars themselves. Peer-reviewed research published in Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry proposed that specific carved symbols on Pillar 43, the same pillar whose lower sections remain unexcavated, record a cosmic impact event dated to approximately 10,950 BCE. The carvings on this interpretation are not decorative. They are documentary. A civilization sophisticated enough to track stellar positions across generations encoded a record of catastrophe in stone at a site that was then buried at the precise historical moment the catastrophe's aftermath was reshaping the planet. This is not a fringe reading imposed on ambiguous evidence. It is a peer-reviewed proposal based on archaeo-astronomical analysis of the pillar geometry and iconography. It may not be the final word, but it is a serious word, and it demands serious engagement rather than institutional dismissal. Göbekli Tepe is not an anomaly in the regional landscape. It is one of dozens of ultra-ancient sites identified across Anatolia dating to the same period, collectively representing a concentration of early complex human activity that has no parallel anywhere else on Earth at that time. The standard civilizational timeline places the cradle of organized human society in Mesopotamia, several thousand years later. The physical evidence in the ground in Turkey places it earlier and further north. If the builders of Gobekli Tepe understood what was coming, encoded it in their most permanent medium, and then deliberately sealed the site to preserve it against whatever followed, the statue found face down beneath the rubble takes on a different weight entirely. Not a ritual offering, a remnant. Something that survived the filling in because it was already there when the burial began. Return to the statue, a carved figure with a peg base, built to stand upright, found face down beneath a rubble wall that shares no constructional language with the precision pillars surrounding it. Archaeologists offered an explanation. The explanation does not fit the object, the wall, or the site. That gap between the institutional account and what the physical evidence demonstrates is not new at Gobekli Tepe. It has been present for 30 years, widening quietly as each new study pushes the site's implications further than the consensus is prepared to follow. 128 pillars remain underground. Pillar 43 remains partially unread. A site that may have recorded a planetary catastrophe in stone is still mostly buried. The statue was found. The explanation given for it did not survive examination. At a site this significant, that should not be the end of the inquiry. It should be the beginning.